The emperor gave me a little tap on the cheek, his signal mark of affection. From the first, I had seen he only wanted an excuse to go back on his words. I did not wait for dismissal to go off with such good news. But the emperor called me back and instructed me to persuade Monsieur Narishkin to dine with us. He added that he would send him back to the Russian outpost in a few days, but that I was not to mention it. As to Monsieur Vinciquerota, the emperor said to me jokingly, you don't take so much interest in him because he isn't a Russian. Then he began again the tale of all his faults. He is a secret agent of the London government. He was a spy in Vienna, a spy in Petersburg. He is a framer of intrigues wherever he goes and doesn't deserve the least consideration, certainly not on any grounds, the post of aide-de-camp to the Tsar Alexander. For close personal duties of that kind belong only to born subjects, honorable men against whom there is no political scandal. In this conversation with the emperor, I brought in, as we had agreed, the Prince of Neuchâtel, the plea that in the interest of French prisoners, some consideration should be shown this man. That will not be the reason, replied the emperor sharply, for my showing him mercy. His behavior has put him outside ordinary rights. It is because I never really wanted to do him any harm, and though the Emperor Alexander is at fault in making such a man his aide-de-camp, I will not be likewise at fault in ill-using a man who is particularly close to him. I shall send him to France with a good escort to prevent him from intriguing throughout Europe with 3 or 4 other firebrands of his sort. The emperor, in dismissing me, told me again not to mention as yet his good intentions towards Monsieur Vinciquerota. I confined myself to telling the Prince of Neuchâtel that he could be easy about the fate of his prisoner, and he went with the King of Naples to dine in the emperor's quarters, intending to obtain a definite decision in this matter. A moment later, the emperor sent for me again, just as we were having dinner, and questioned me about the family and mode of life of young Narishkin. He directed me to tell Narishkin, as though it were from myself, that he wanted peace, that it rested with the Tsar to make an honorable one, that his position was very favorable and enabled him to offer good terms to the Tsar Alexander. Because it was clear that no military reverse compelled him to it, that the moment was no less favorable to Russia, as the movement of the French army, being in some sort of a retreat, counterbalanced the constant advantages our troops had obtained and put both governments in a position to negotiate with honor. That the emperor would possibly send him, Narishkin, back to the outpost because he knew that his family were particularly close to the Tsar, and he did not wish the Tsar to remain any longer in anxiety about Narishkin's safety. I went back to Monsieur Narishkin, who had dined with us. I reassured him as to his general's fate and carried out all the emperor's instructions. Meanwhile, the King of Naples and the Prince of Neuchâtel talked to the emperor with their usual amiability. Monsieur Vinciquerota was regarded as a prisoner and sent to France, and Monsieur Narishkin with him. I gave Monsieur Narishkin some money, and after overtaking our carriages on the following day, sent him an overcoat, as he had only his uniform. My body servant found them marching with the head of our column, which they followed as far as Gayette. Thence they were started off to Paris with an officer and a guardsman as escort. Chance served them well, for they were set free by Monsieur Chernichev and a troop of Cossacks who fell in with them beyond Borisov. The Duke of Treviso had evacuated Moscow on the 23rd after blowing up the Kremlin and the barracks in accordance with the orders he had received. On the 27th, he was at Moyaisk. For there, several days, they had been sending back the wounded by the scanty means of transport that they'd been able to get together. Some consignments of rice had arrived there, and the Duke of Abrantes had established depots which supplied the needs of the first arrivals. The following day, the 28th, we passed within sight of Moyaisk, but did not enter it. On his way by, the emperor halted beside the road to obtain some account of the evacuation and of the distribution of supplies that he had ordered for the wounded. He himself took part in placing many of them in his own carriages and in any that passed. In spite of all warnings that this would inevitably mean death, the unfortunate men who had left the field hospital to drag themselves along the road were placed by his orders wherever they could hang on the covers of wagons and even in the forage carts, or in the back of vehicles already crowded with the sick and wounded from Malo-Yaroslavets. And in due course, they were the victims of the emperor's good intentions, who had thought to remove them from any danger they might run through the barbarity of the Russian peasants. Those who did not die of exhaustion through the discomforts of their position either fell victims to the cold nights or died of hunger. The wounded of the guard and those who were in the emperor's carriages were nourished and cared for, but the rest, since all the other carriages were lost, not a score of them reached Vilna. Men in the best of health could not have endured this mode of travel and could not have held on to the vehicles in the positions in which most of them were placed. So one can imagine the state of these unhappy men when they had covered a league or two. They had to endure jolting, fatigue, and cold all at once. The carriages, drawn by tired and underfed horses, were traveling 14 to 15 hours of the 24. They kept to the road and found no place that afforded them any supplies. During the halts, the drivers went aside from the road with some of their horses in search of food and fodder, however poor in the deserted villages and encampments. Being uncertain as to what they would have tomorrow, they kept whatever they found carefully to themselves. Often, they had not even time to start a fire. Never was there a sadder fate, a more wretched or hopeless position. Inevitable death seemed to beset us on all sides. The surgeons and doctors, with neither food nor physic nor bandages, and having for the most part not even bread for themselves, were forced to shun the hapless sick or wounded to whom they could no longer be of any service. As far as Orcha, we had to cross a veritable desert. The country on either hand of our route had been marched over, eaten out, and left bare by the army and by the detachments that joined us. The plight of the carriages can be imagined. Having left Moscow with us, already full of refugees, women and children, they had had to take up the men wounded at Winkovo and Malo-Yaroslavets. And to these, as I have said, were added also to the wounded at Moyeysk. They were put on the top seats of the carts and the forecarriage behind on the trunks, on the seats, in the fodder carts. They were even put on the hoods of the wagons where there was no room underneath. One can imagine the spectacle of our convoys presented. At the least jolt, those who were most insecurely placed fell off. The drivers took no care. The driver following, if he were not distracted or in a stupor, would not be minding his horses, or even for fear of stopping and losing his place in the line, he would drive piteously over the body of the wretch who had fallen. Nor did other vehicles coming behind pay any heed. My eyes never saw a sight so horrible as the march of our army 48 hours after Moyeysk. Every heart was closed to pity by the fear of starving, of losing the overladen vehicles, of seeing the horses die, already exhausted by toil and starvation. I still shudder when I say that I have seen men deliberately driving their horses at speed over rough ground so as to get rid of the unfortunates with whom they were overweighted. And although they knew that hoofs would mutilate them or wheels crush them, they would yet smile triumphantly when a jolt freed them of one of those wretches. Every man thought of himself and of himself alone. Every man felt that his life depended on the preservation of his little vehicle with its few provisions, and would have sacrificed 20 lives to spare the poor hacks that drew this last treasure. Each heartened himself with the thought that in front of him he would find foodstuff. But except in some large towns such as Smolensk, which had a few stores, they found nothing. The horses were fed on rotting corn and straw from old encampments, except when they were driven off from the road for at least a league's distance at the risk of capture and massacre. On the 28th, the headquarters staff halted at Ust-Pinskoye, a ruined manor house between Moyeysk and Borodino. At 2 a.m, the emperor sent for me. He was in bed. He told me to see that the door was well closed and come and sit close to the bed. This was not his habit. He then spoke to me about the situation in general and about the state of the army, whose extreme disorganization he still did not or would not admit. He ended by bidding me speak to him frankly and tell him what I myself thought. I did not have to be pressed, but gave the emperor my opinion in full on the consequences that would ensue from the disorganization of the army, and especially on the miseries that would be caused by the severe cold. I reminded him of the reply which the Tsar Alexander was reported to have made when he received, through Lauriston, the proposals of peace sent from Moscow. My campaign is just beginning. I told him that he must take this reply literally. The further the season advanced, the more everything would favor the Russians and, above all, the Cossacks.